Current research is showing that young children more than ever is needing an ecology of care in light of the various mental and physical health challenges they face within and beyond the birthing process. During this time of Christmas, in celebrating the birth of Jesus, we Christians are reminded of the need to care for our precious little ones. Today's guest will share pertinent information for adults, clergy, and religious institutions and how to provide an ecology of care for our young children. Please stay tuned. Welcome to Perspectives on Faith and Culture. Today I'm joined by Dr. Cassandra Joubert of the Children's Institute of Fresno State, and I'm Dr. Karen Crozier. Welcome to the show, Dr. Joubert.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. So please share, as a professor and director there at the Children's Institute, how did you become involved in children's mental health issues?
Well, initially my interest was just in children, all children. Then I sort of developed an interest in psychology. And I melded those two in getting a degree in maternal and child health, which is a public health degree, and was sort of on a public health path. And then I had a special child. This child was diagnosed with bipolar illness at age 16. Then I started to question everything I had learned about developmental psychology and everything I had learned about children, because nothing prepared me to raise a child with a mental health disorder. And over time, I learned more and more. I ended up getting a graduate certificate in infant parent mental health, and that sort of set me on this huge path of advocacy for all children that have brain-based disorders.
Wow, that was, how long was that? About a 20-year time span?
Yes, well, let's not talk about just how long ago that was, but I can tell you that my career took some turns because my child was so ill. I actually had to come out of the workforce, and it was during that time that I wrote a book about my journey with her, a memoir that tells the story about what it was like from the time she was born, when there was some very clear evidence that she had some emotional challenges, up until the time she was diagnosed at age 16, and even the book talks a little bit about her early years in college. So it was quite a journey, but it's a journey that has informed my passion for children's mental health.
Yes, and as we look at the various trends and issues facing young children and mental health today, in light of the research, share what have you come to understand as some of these critical trends and issues that our viewing audience need to be made aware of?
I think the biggest issue is that we are actually documenting that about 1 in 5 children have some kind of mental disorder. And that's much higher than one would think. And I mean, historically, there was even a belief that young children didn't have mental illness, that it was really older people that could be diagnosed. But with each generation, we're able to diagnose children younger and younger as having autism, developmental delays, ADHD, depression, bipolar, etc. And this is a trend that we really need to take notice of, because it has great implications for how we interact with children and how we educate our children.
And so what is the Center for Disease Control sharing about what they have discovered in light of the present trends and issues?
So they have just done their first ever surveillance report on children's mental health. Historically, we haven't had really ways to document how many kids are affected, but they've been able to show that anywhere from 13 to 20% of children in America are affected by some kind of mental illness. So when that statistic came out, along with the evidence around autism, which is really showing that there is a growing trend in autism in this country, they really said this is a call to action. This is something that everyone who has any kind of interaction with children need to be aware of.
Yes, you shared various forms of diagnoses, ADHD, autism. Can you explain to our viewing audience what are those particular diagnoses and what are some of the manifestations or symptoms that parents or adult caregivers in churches would be able to notice?
So, I mean, obviously each of those is very different and very complex, but there are some signs that one might notice in young children that would cause you to question whether or not there was a mental health diagnosis? For example, with children with autism or developmental delay, you might see delayed speech, you might see deficits in social interaction, you might see repetitive behaviors. On the other hand, children with ADHD, you'll see a lot of impulsiveness, sort of being out of control, hyperactive, if you will. And then there are children that have what we call emotional dysregulation, which means simply that they have trouble containing their emotions, regulating them, expressing them appropriately. And that often actually is not necessarily a clinical diagnosis. It could be in response to trauma or exposure to violence or really dysfunction and chaos within the home that's causing the child to manifest some behaviors that would be concerning.
So those are some very deep diagnoses and needs that our children have. And in light of your leadership as professor and director at the Children's Institute at Fresno State, what have been some of the ways in which your leadership in that particular institute have responded to these trends and issues of the needs that are happening among our young children?
So what we hear people who work with young children say, what we call the birth to 5 practitioner workforce, what we hear them say is that they are not prepared to really know how to manage the behaviors of these young children. Some of them are so dysregulated that they are creating chaos in the preschool. They're being suspended or expelled from preschool. Others, by the time they get to school, they can't really learn because the emotional dysregulation is interfering with their ability to integrate cognitive information. So first and foremost, we have to prepare our workforce to understand these disorders, to recognize them in children, and then to put in place strategies and interventions to really help them. So for the last several years at the Children's Institute, we've been doing training programs for birth to 5 practitioners to help them not only understand some of these mental disorders that I've spoken about, but also what are some of the effective evidence-based strategies for dealing with these children in the classroom. Believe it or not, we can almost project and predict that if these children have undiagnosed, untreated challenges at very young ages, that will follow them into elementary, middle school, and high school, and these are often the children who are having to be put in alternative educational environments, or they drop out, they enter the prison pipeline, if you will, and so it's just really critical that we get to them as early as possible with intervention strategies.
So one of the things that I recall in the literature that I understand, that early relationships matter. So
Absolutely.
Can you share more about those particular aspects?
So one of the most exciting things about working with children birth to 5 is that we now have the neuroscience behind us that shows how the architecture of the brain actually develops. I mean, this to me is fascinating. I mean, if you think about,
you're excited.
when you think about building a house, you think about, well, we're going to put the foundation down, and then we're going to, put up the walls and then the roof. Well, and so you can almost see in your mind the blueprint of a house that you're building. The brain is very similar in that the architecture of the brain, the neuronal pathways, et cetera, are forming largely, 90% of them are forming by year 3, by the child's 3rd year of life. And the way that the neuronal pathways, if you will, or sort of the 2x4s, if you want to use the analogy, in the brain are forming is through interaction, what we call serve and return. So if you use the tennis analogy, you've got a person that's hitting the ball across the net and the other person's hitting it back, and so there's this dyadic interface but in the game. That dyadic interface also applies to the caregiver and child relationship. The more they interact, I say something, the child babbles back, the mother or caregiver says something else, that's actually building neuronal pathways in the brain. So imagine what happens if a mother is depressed, or if a child is in any way neglected, if no one is reading, singing, or talking to a child, the architecture of the brain isn't developing. And so it's critical that no matter who interfaces with a child, that they understand. We often say that children are sponges, and people kind of can relate to that. But not only are they taking in information that they can then give you back, but their brain is actually being developed with every relationship, every interaction that that young child has. To me, the brain science and being able to see this on a PET scan, it's just fascinating. I mean, we can see how the neural pathways are becoming more complex, and they're webbing together, and they're firing, all in response to the environment that that child is in.
And so that's also including the home and the broader ecological environment, school, religious institutions. You want to share any more about that? The social emotional development as well?
So the good news, there's the good news and the bad news. The good news is that every interaction, every experience that a very young child has is influencing the brain development. That's the good news. The bad news is that every experience the young child is having is influencing brain development. So if those experiences are positive and nurturing, and there's a consistent caregiver there, and the attachment system is very strong between the caregiver and the child, then all the wonderful things are happening in the brain. On the other hand, if there is neglect or violence or trauma or chaos, then something happens in the brain called pruning, because there is a response to trauma and stress that the brain has that can be damaging. So we're really laying the foundation for social and emotional development whenever we interact with a young child. And parents need to know this, but parents obviously aren't the only ones that interact. When the child goes to church on Sunday and there's a child care provider there, that interaction is important. When neighbors and friends and others interact with the child, all of that is having an influence. So that simply means that we all have a role and a place.
So if I'm hearing you correctly as well, is that not only children who may come with mental and physical challenges in the womb, but also they are very vulnerable outside of the womb based upon the lack of a positive influence of an ecology of care.
Absolutely. There's something we call epigenetics, which is the combination, it's sort of the melding of the environment and the genes. So a child will come into the world with a certain genetic composition, right, that they got from their parents. And then there will be the experiences that will shape the gene. So the gene actually changes in response to the experiences that the child has. So it's very complex, but in a way, you can really boil it down very simply, is that it's not nature or nurture, it's nature and nurture. Those two things together are really what predict healthy outcomes for kids.
Wow. So science has moved beyond the either or debate and understanding the both and as significant. It probably could say both and, right?
Absolutely.
And so what are those particular safety nets that we are providing for children? You want to share anything more about your leadership in that area?
Well, I think we really need to do far more public awareness about the early brain science. And I'm pleased to say that over the last decade, there's been considerable public information out there about Talk, Read, and Sing, for example, or other campaigns that help people become more aware that those early years are really critical. So raising awareness is a big issue. I think second to that, though, the reality is that families have to have support in raising their children. So, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, the majority of women were not in the workforce. So our social profile, if you will, has changed. And so now more responsibility is being placed on the larger society to support and nurture children, whether that's in a child care center or maybe it's a in a family daycare home or a preschool, whatever the case may be, the responsibility for shaping that young brain is now, as you mentioned earlier, more ecological. It's broader, and so we can't just target parents with this information. We've got to be talking to all the institutions in our neighborhoods and communities because they have a role as well.
Yes, we're getting ready to take a break. When we come back from the break, we'll zone in more on what actual religious institutions and other agencies can do in providing this ecology of care. We'll have a break and be back in 60 seconds. Welcome back to Perspectives on Faith and Culture, and I'm joined today with Dr. Cassandra Joubert as we are talking about young children and mental health. Before the break, we were focusing on how religious institutions and other agencies need to partner alongside families because parents are not the sole respondent and caregiver in this broader ecology of care. More specifically, in your experience and expertise, how can religious institutions participate in addressing these various trends and issues that you named earlier in the show?
So there are ways to support the family, and there are ways to support the individual child. And I think that those two things go hand in hand. So if religious institutions have access to children either through their child care centers or their day camps or other recreational opportunities where they work with young children, they should be aware that every moment and every interaction matters in terms of whether or not that interaction is really promoting brain development or if it's stifling brain development in some way. So that's when we talk about their interactions with the individual child. On the other hand, religious institutions also have a huge role in supporting families. I mean, we know that, our obligation to take care of the poor, our obligation to take care of the sick, our obligation to take care of those who are struggling is a key sort of role that religious institutions play. And that indirectly really does support the individual child because no child lives alone. I mean, children live within families. And so to the extent that the family is supported, whether that's through addressing issues around food insecurity or helping them access quality care, helping maybe someone get out of a domestic violence situation, or helping someone even get higher education. I mean, all of those social supports that families really need to ensure that they can provide for the basic needs of children and that they can really support the healthy development because their own stress is reduced. Those are critical strategies, and so we may not see them as directly impacting children, but they do.
Right, and what I'm appreciating as I hear you speak, these are what we can do beyond medicine and not dependent upon medicine, because sometimes I believe we are a culture that becomes heavily dependent upon treatment. Yes. And forgetting the social, emotional, relational, spiritual touch that is necessary that can be just as therapeutic and healing.
Can't undermine that.
Yeah.
Because, and I love that this whole field of early childhood mental health really talks about a continuum of care, from promotion, where you're really helping to build those healthy early relationships, to prevention, where you might have a child who is at risk because they're in a situation that's not optimal. And then you have, at the other end of the continuum, the treatment, which is, of course is after the fact. It's after a child already has some behavioral or developmental challenge. And so it's important to recognize that from a population-based perspective, those things we do on the promotion end, on the front end, long before difficulties arise, are really, really where we want. First of all, it's the most economically, what's the term?
Cost-effective.
Cost-effective, cost-beneficial,
right.
Versus waiting until they need some expensive form of care. And then, our healthcare dollars are dwindling and growing to the extent that we have to support so many people that already have problems. So to get on the front end is really where our institutions can really play a role.
And in the context, particularly within Central California, what has been some of your observations of children's and mental health trends and issues?
So one of the things that is really striking for the Central California region is that we have very, very high rates of poverty. And with the high rates of poverty come chronic stress within families as they try to figure out, how they're going to provide for the basic needs of children. That chronic stress, which the medical literature calls toxic stress, is what really has the greatest impact on the brain. So to the extent that there is a struggle that families are having to provide for the basics, that's a toxic stress environment. Then on top of the poverty, you have often high rates of child abuse and neglect in our region. And this is an issue that we pay more attention to, sort of the physical abuse, but really, if you look at the statistics, the weight is really at the neglect level, and that's where kids are really suffering far more in terms of numbers. We have far more children who are neglected than we have who are physically or emotionally or sexually abused.
And when you say neglected, you're saying they're not getting their basic needs met, no shelter, no food?
Not only no shelter and no food, but they're also not getting their emotional needs met. And this is what's so critical, is that people, when we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of need, we really need to add to that human interaction and important nurturing early relationships. Because again, if we go back to our discussion about how the brain develops, your brain will not develop optimally unless you have sort of those positive, joyful, engaging interaction with caring adults. So that becomes a basic need. And so neglect has both the physical component, but it also has the social and emotional component.
And also, to my knowledge and observation, that more and more teenagers and young people are caring for their younger siblings. Has that been one of your observations as well?
Yes, of course. Sadly, one of our real challenges in the Valley is the methamphetamine epidemic. And so we have a lot of families whose the parents are affected by substance abuse. And as a result, the siblings are often caring for the youngest children. And not only does that interfere with the development of the youngest ones, but it also interferes with the healthy development of the siblings. Because we know by looking at the brain science that really the brain continues to develop until you're 25 or 26 years old. So if you're talking about a child who's 13, that child's brain is still developing. And then if they now have the responsibility for a younger sibling, they're experiencing that toxic stress and that level of responsibility that's really inappropriate for them, because they're still developing themselves and they still need to be meeting and taking care of their own developmental milestones. So, substance abuse is a huge issue, as is in the Valley domestic violence. We also know that children who witness violence, exposed to violence, they're definitely going to have some traumatic effects on their brain, and their brains will not develop optimally. I should add, though, having said that the brain is very plastic. And so, as I was talking earlier about epigenetics, you can remediate, if you will, and remedy some of the problems that children experience early on, but there has to be a change in the environment. So it's the chronicity of the exposure to stress that's the problem. If you have a period in your life where, let's say, a young child has a parent that's incarcerated, or there's a divorce, or a parent dies, that child will experience the stress of that event, for a period of time. But with the intervention of a caring, stable, nurturing adult, that can be the pain and the trauma of that early adversity can be remedied. And that's what we want our religious institutions to understand, that you know, the game isn't over, you know, when a child gets to a particular age. If they've experienced some kind of trauma, that opportunity to heal and to recover from that trauma is ongoing. And so every interaction with a child, regardless of age, really matters.
So in light of your observations, what is one thing that in the Valley that brings you hope?
Well, first of all, I am just overwhelmed that so many people care about young children. When we started doing our training program at Fresno State for birth to 5 practitioners, our first year we attracted 160 practitioners to our training program. We offered it a second year, had another 160 with a waiting list. Right now we're doing a training program, we've got 75 people engaged, and it just keeps growing. The interest in young children, the thirst for understanding the early brain science is really, we really should commend ourselves for that. There is no shortage of thirst for how can we do this better. The passion is there. The resources aren't always there, and that's something that we continue to work on. But that's very hopeful to me. When I announce that we're going to have a new training program and I've got a waiting list, you know, of 50 people saying that we want to get in, that says to me that people not only care, but they want the best knowledge, they want to do the best work in their field, and they want to help children.
I think that is possibly a good closing moment on that, as far as people are hopeful and encouraged in this process. Yes. So 5 seconds or less, anything you would like to say to the audience?
I would like to just call people to some of the latest research around adverse childhood experiences. And I'll just say ACEs. If you want to know more about this topic, if you want to know the impact that these adverse experiences have, go online and learn as much as you can about it.
Great. Well, thank you for watching the show today. Thank you for being a guest, Dr. Joubert. Hope you have a great day. Take care, and God bless.